Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. In many traditions, including, I believe, the Goenka tradition, and certainly in the Thai forest tradition, there is a tradition, it is observed, dating from the time of the Buddha, that a Dhamma desana, a Dhamma talk, is given in a kind of top-down manner, where the teacher offers comments and they're received in a kind of, a quiet, receptive mode. But this is not written in stone. And questions are good, comments are good, reflections are good. So I like sometimes to have a more engaged kind of discussion. I'm not alone in this. The great Thai master Thanajan Dun pretty much only will give his Dhamma desanas in kind of question Q&A format. We've been developing a theme of reflecting on samadhi in this course, and we've worked our way through most of the parts of the sutta that I think Atipamuta has in mind. So I thought maybe this evening we could just see what in the passage that we chanted tonight or in any of the other passages kind of alive for you, what you'd like to discuss. And Jonathan already got started. I did have actually some reflections on that passage to share, and maybe you could say a little more about what you were drawn to in it. What do you want to know about it? What is it? How did it land with you?
Well, it talked about the qualities of samadhi when they're, flawless and without corruption, then creating a body, and I didn't quite understand that.
I'm going to share just a few quick reflections, and then we can each say something about the mind-made body. There are, as I'm sure you've noticed, these repetitive passages, stock passages, that the text is often built up out of, repeating sections that either are like from a few words in length up to many whole paragraphs that will just get repeated over and over. And the first one that you mentioned, they're called pericopes, or sometimes just stock passages. The first one that you mentioned is the one, I don't quite remember Bhante Sujato's language, but often the word malleable is used. The mind becomes bright, clear, purified, malleable, workable. This is the product of samadhi. The great benefit of samadhi is the mind is transported to this place where it's at last able to be turned towards whatever you want to use it for. And then in this passage that we looked at tonight, we saw a number of the different things that it can be used for. And the first two that are given, I think, are very, very interesting in their contrast. The contrast between the two, to me, it strikes at the richness of the different discourses and teachings that are woven together throughout the suttas. The different the suttas came into being in a way that is not agreed upon by all Buddhists. Some see it as more of a unitary work that came together all at once. The traditional account is that there was a council where all of the Buddha's disciples came together not that long after his death, agreed on the wording of the oral tradition, and it was recorded. In the secular world, it's understood to have developed over time, over a greater period of time, with different schools converging, different redactions, things added, things taken out, until it reached its final form centuries after the Buddha's death. either way, it's rich and alive with meaning. And I think it's really fruitful for us to find a way to talk about it together when we are coming at it from different directions, rather than following the course of history and dividing up and going to war with each other over it. The sectarian period started several centuries after the Buddha's death. There was a fragmentation into what's called 18 different schools, but actually was probably many more schools. 18 was one of these catch-all numbers for a lot. And there was the great split between the Mahayana and the Theravada, which, as legend had it, started in terrible bloodshed in Sri Lanka with the monks of the Mahavihara holding up the torch of tradition, and the kind of renegade innovators of the Abhayagiri monastery in the south of Sri Lanka getting all innovative until the king had them wiped out. So my sense is that this is really not the way to go. And I was kind of reflecting on this on the ride over here, that like here we are with a war literally starting today in the world, and in our own little Buddhist world, we've got this fragmentation of ideas where monks are often in tension with each other over ideas, and lay people no less. So actually, one of the great things that I really tremendously appreciate about Panten Pikamuto is that we've remained and become even closer friends, I think, over the years of being monks together, him many more than me, but from my conditioning, my background, I'm just not a kind of traditionalist in the way I think, and I've often challenged traditional readings of different sutta passages, and we've had countless fruitful discussions that I think have only enriched my understanding and made us closer friends. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but probably we'll find a few of those points tonight. In thinking about this passage. Anyway, so with regard to the mind-made body and the passage that comes immediately before it, I think there's this very interesting contrast that shows a convergence of two different traditions. This is my personal impression. The first insight that's brought forward when the mind becomes malleable and workable and able to see with penetrating insight is this incredible pericope, shows up in a number of different places, about what it is that we have insight into. And that is this body made up of the four great elements, procreated by mother and father, built up of rice and gruel, subject to wearing away and breaking up, and this mind bound up with and dependent upon it. And then immediately after that, we get this glorious mind-made body, like a reed drawn from its sheath, totally separate. And to me, there's this striking contrast where in the former, just as we arrive at this incredible crescendo of vision and knowledge and purity and direct access to truth, what we see is the impermanence of the body, the transience of life, and the utter dependence of our consciousness on the conditions of our physical existence. And then, in the very next paragraph, we get this vision of the mind being so heightened that it can extricate itself from its very physical basis and exist independently of the body. To me, it's a really striking contrast, very powerful.
So does it have to do with supernatural?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So there's we didn't they are actually all enumerated in brief, but
Yeah.
that paragraph on psychic powers lists is it 6 abhinyas, the supernatural powers, which I can only understand in a kind of a sort of metaphorical way. The science of the time, the sort of cosmology of the time, was very different. The sun and the moon were equivalent enough that you can stroke the face of each of them, and it's a kind of parallel experience. Why don't you share your impressions? I've kind of drawn the contrast. What do you do with that, Bhante?
Well, as you said, Bhante, I am on the traditional side. So when I come to these passages, I tend to take a look at them and be like, what could this mean?
Yeah.
I come from the perspective of, let's just go, this was preserved for some reason. It was felt to be, in the Buddhist simile, he grabbed a handful of leaves from the forest floor and he said, which is more, the leaves in my hand or the leaves in the forest? And so this is one of the ones in the hand. It's been preserved meticulously for at least centuries, if not millennia. So why is it put in this form? And I think it is very striking that the first thing that is said is, you cannot deny there is a body. And so you asked the other day, is the breath a mental object? And I think that is the first thing that you notice, is that the things that you can say objectively are right there in front of us. There is a body. It is made of the 4 great elements. And now I've actually run like day longs where I'm running through mindfulness of the body and like pointing out to people the disparity between the physical body that we can all recognize that is here and what we think the physical body is. I'll have them like moving their arms or rotating their head and being like, so what do you think is actually happening? And like really like visualize it. And they're visualizing rubber bands and they're visualizing blobs and all of these things. And when it comes down to it, it's like, that's not what's there. And when we're in a diluted state, often we find that we've got go-betweens to do anything. We want to turn our head, so we tense this part of our head, and then we tense our shoulders, and somehow the head moves. Because, we've built on all these sankharas on top of each other. I think what happens and what's being pointed to is that as the mind is purified, it has to settle on something, and it can't settle on itself necessarily, because the mental landscape is always changing. So the construct of a physical body that is changing very slowly is very soothing. And I think the Buddha also points using the jhana suttas, which always refer back to the body, and saying that you don't have to, but you can establish your samadhi with the body as an anchor. And if you do this, the mind is going to permeate the body such that the mental body stops being like springs and wires and coils and blobs and actually becomes a complete facsimile of the physical body. Because why not? It doesn't have to be. It could be all these weird sankharas and go-betweens, but the physical body is stable. And having produced a mental facsimile then. What I thought was interesting as we were going through it, I realized we were talking about Tibetan poet practice the other day. And this idea of the mind being able to be extracted from the body. And so, you could say, well, that's not really what the Buddha taught. Well, actually, it is almost word for word what the Buddha taught. And that is how that tradition developed. Like, if we were back in the Buddhist time, they might have been talking about something like poet practice in these terms. People might have been doing practices and getting, having the grass stuck in their head and all of those things that we saw, yeah. Because it would be understood that this is a fruit of the holy life, that when your mind can know every facet of the body without delusion, you can make any body you want, and you can travel among the stars with it, which I don't know if I take it to be a metaphor. I don't think anybody was striking the sun personally. So,
You can follow up with those questions. There's some initial thoughts. We can go further with that. Or talk about other passages. Any other...
Well, maybe if you explain a little bit the progression. So the progression is, you develop the samadhi, you turn that toward the body, which is impermanent within sight, and then you create a mind-made body. And so it's a kind of a projection, basically, a kind of a supernatural projection of...
Well, it depends how you interpret it, but to back up just a little bit, the jhana development described in the previous section that we looked at yesterday is one that entails an awareness of the body.
Yeah.
And this is in a little bit of contrast to the description you might get in talking about absorptions wherein you are not sensing the body. And again, I think we just have to accept these as developments, as accounts that we don't have to try to reconcile them, we can explore them separately. That's my own sense of it. I come from kind of a language background, studying literature and studying how among the things I studied was how text developed. The language itself changed over time, like the meaning of certain Pali terms changed over time. While the word jhana continued to be used to describe these advanced stages of meditation, it could well be that the stages that are being talked about in the absorptions where one loses the sense of the body are different developments, different ways that the mind can go. In any case, and the suttas, the description that we looked at does reference the feelings in the body and awareness of the body. The shift that you're pointing to in the section that we came to tonight is not like a different perspective on the body. It's a shift from samadhi to vipassana, a shift from collecting the mind, bringing it to the oneness at each of these different levels for second, third, and fourth jhana. The culmination being the samadhi of equanimity and purified mindfulness, and then turning that to insight, to knowledge and vision, as it's put here, to using it for understanding. And the 8 different passages that we get they're more like possibilities of what you can do with this samadhi that you've developed, what vipassana you can pursue. Maybe that was unnecessary to say, but it's not like this is a program you have to go through step by step. These are things you can explore. And what we'll come to, I guess, tomorrow night is going to be the 3 knowledges, the liberation knowledges. These are kind of preliminary ones. Mm-hmm. Although that's debatable.
Well, yeah, I think I like the similes, yeah, like the potter, the goldsmith, or the ivory worker. The idea is that you have developed this samadhi, and it culminates in the 4th jhana, which is like having a white cloth draped over your head. You would, every single part of you would be covered by the cloth, and that's the mind at the 4th jhana. There is no disparity, there is no subject-object duality, there's just the body, and it's completely permeated by the mind. But that's not yet vipassana. That's just concentration based, capable of seeing the body. But the act of vipassana is to actually turn the mind and say, what is it? And that's where we're talking about knowledge now. We're talking about then you see it is made up of the 4 elements. And you begin to understand the 4 elements, and you begin to understand how they interact and the structure of the world. And you begin to realize how it all connects. And so, having understood that, anything that you would want to do, you can now do. But it wasn't until you turned your mind towards it. And some people develop a level of samadhi, and that's all they get. And so we've also talked about this when we talked about the iddhipada, yeah? We were talking about just that capability. Is like maybe the reason people only get samadhi from their samadhi is because they didn't think, well, what do I want to do? They didn't think, well, I'd like to be able to remember, what my house was like when I was 2 years old. I would like to be able to do math problems. I would like to be able to smack somebody with a meta beam that completely blisses them out. The only reason they haven't is because there wasn't sufficient samadhi and that they didn't turn their mind to it. So the Buddha is saying you can do these things now that your mind is purified.
So this isn't so much a series of progressions. You're saying it's kind of a menu of options. Is that,
That's what we're saying about
Yeah,
this
you
passage
totally
we looked
skip
at tonight.
yeah.
And in fact, we're kind of encouraged to say, okay, but what's the really useful thing to do here? And the abhinyas, the supernatural powers, are set out as an option. And clearly, in some suttas, they're maybe positioned as more desirable than in others. But I would say, on balance, the encouragement is that's not what this samadhi is really most fruitfully used for. You want to turn it towards
Liberation.
towards insight, exactly. And
But I can just say, I think it is something to note that they are presented here in the context of the sutta as verifiable fruits of spiritual practice. So if somebody can shoot a fireball out of their finger, you can say that that's useless. Nevertheless, they could not have done that if they didn't do the work. So these are things they really appreciated in ancient India. Like if somebody had put work into something, even if it was something as seemingly ridiculous as being able to stand on one foot their entire life, you nevertheless had a certain amount of respect for the energy and the interest and the concentration of mental energies needed to succeed in that. It's a menu of things that you could develop, if you put your mind to it. And that's also what's said by the teachers, is like they're often encouraging you to develop your samadhi before thinking about the psychic powers. Because with your mind fully developed, it's just like the ivory worker, the goldsmith, the potter. You can make whatever you want, and you won't have much difficulty. There's nothing standing in the way.
So can you distinguish, like, the paragraph where you turn your samadhi toward basically impermanence, that precedes the higher knowledges that is going to come a little bit later? Is that the case?
not necessarily. Certainly in this list it does.
Yeah.
Actually,
So I guess my question is, well, isn't that a kind of a description of liberation then and there?
Yeah, and that's where I'm seeing the sort of composite nature of this particular sutta, because that really is kind of, to me, a sort of summary of the climax. And we actually saw a pericope, one of these stock passages, that's sometimes called the jhana summary, just before, I think we read it 2 nights ago, just before the description of the first jhana, you get this one paragraph that actually summarizes all 4 jhanas. The body becomes glad, and then rapture arises, and pity arises, and then it gives way to bliss, and then it gives way to mindfulness and equanimity. And then you come to the first jhana. To me, that suggests, so that one paragraph kind of summarizes the whole cycle. There's actually 2 ways to understand that. It can be understood as, well, we've got a composite text where first we get the summary, and then we get the elaboration. Or you can understand it actually, this is more of a spiral than a straightforward progression where these states are developing a kind of momentum that repeats and gets stronger each time until you get to this breakthrough level of sort of an amplification, a kind of feedback-like elevation of the whole mind where anyway, we've already done that passage. The jhana takes us to a stage of unification of mind. It's somehow sometimes translated where the distractions drop away. But yeah, so I think you're discerning something really important there, which is that we can parse this text. We can kind of break it apart and see how it's got this self-nesting quality in places like that. I was going to reference our brief allusion yesterday to the jhana wars, one of the sort of central topics is, well, and this is one of the central points of contention that people really do get heated about. We generally manage not to somehow. But there's another sutta, is it Majjhima Nikaya 111, where I think it's Sariputta is going through the jhanas, but in each one he's only really mastering it when he sees impermanence while he's in the jhana.
Yeah.
And the idea there is that, well, samadhi is really secondary. The point is that you use samadhi itself to investigate. It becomes the topic of insight. But then here, and throughout the gradual training suttas, the different suttas where it's described as a gradual training, you're not thinking, you're not like contemplating anything while you're in jhana. You're in it. Your whole mind is doing that thing that you do at each of the different stages. The contemplation comes afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the mainstream idea is the one that we're encountering here, is that samadhi leads to, is preparation for vipassana. I don't know what you want to say about that.
Yeah, definitely. And this is,
Would you say that's a both and then, with the Anapada Sutta where you're just describing where it's more integrated,
Yeah.
and then this one where it's more, you get it to a certain point and then you turn it to
Yeah.
those qualities. Is that a both and?
well, yeah, because I think what it boils down to is, at the deepest level, we're not even to enlightenment yet. So even samadhi, yes. And this is the section on vipassana, which the idea of being able to see the body and how it's composed, just like looking at a gem and seeing all its facets. That is the definition of vipassana. Another is like being able to look at a still mountain pool and see all the fish and pebbles and stuff on the bottom. And it's like the definition of the mind doing vipassana. It can see everything clearly. But what enlightenment really is it's not necessarily purification of mind. It's not necessarily vision or knowledge or psychic powers and abilities. What really constitutes enlightenment is a shift in kamma, a shift in activity. So this is all leading to that point where you make a change in how you perceive the world, approach the world, try to achieve your goals in the world, and even have goals in the world. That these need to happen before that happens. So asking, is samadhi and vipassana the same thing, is kind of, neither one is what does the job. It's them working together like two hands washing each other. That gives you the ability to make the changes that you need to. So the higher knowledges are where you actually see the cycles clearly of samsara, and then you decide to get out of them. Which we don't have a word for besides enlightenment. Otherwise, we'd be asking, is it of these three things? Is it samadhi, is it vipassana, or is it that? But they're the way that they work together. Each one has its own function to help us make that change. Theoretically, we could make that change instantaneously. And there are instances of people hearing the Dhamma and just being like, oh, craving is suffering, and just letting it go. But the reality is the gradual training exists for those instances where we heard the Dhamma and we kind of missed the boat. Yeah? So there's work to be done. We didn't have just a little dust in our eyes. We had a whole lot, and we gotta work it out.
And so the jhana wars that you guys were referring to, is that the sort of the differences in terms of the sutta jhana interpretations as opposed to the deeper
You
states?
probably know more about the jhana
Well,
wars than we do.
Yeah.
We just try not to get.
I mean, I
hit by
did my
the
toe.
shells.
I started off kind of at the IMS scene and went and visited the Goenka Center. I did a retreat there, and I read a lot. And what I saw, or what I picked up during that fairly brief 2 or 3 year period, was that there's a lot of people who don't want to think about samadhi, like in the insight scene. That that first generation of teachers who started IMS, who came back from mainly from
Indeed.
Myanmar, but also from I guess Jack Cornfield was in Thailand. They felt that what Samadhi enthusiasts would call access Samadhi was all that you needed, and that doing like the mental noting or that it was enough to just do vipassana, to just kind of watch what came up and reflect on it. But then there's this other subculture of people who are just all about gaining these supernatural powers, and they're just like, what are you people talking about? The vipassana is, that's fine, but like the really cool thing is samadhi. I think that's kind of what the main, I mean, you probably know more about it than me. You've been around people involved in this world for much longer. But it does seem to have many fronts, the jhana wars. The central one is the one I mentioned, I think.
Well, it seems like in what you're describing, it's more about like what level of concentration do you need to liberate, to become liberated. Which it sounds, it seems like you're describing that these traditions that came over, the more modern traditions, were good. They were good with access, but that it seems like also the suttas describe that when they define samadhi, it's the 4 jhanas.
Yeah.
And that you need some achievement of jhana to reach at least the first stage of liberation. So there's that war.
Yes, there's
and then there's the war of just the depth of what the interpretations of what describes a jhana fact, with all its factors in terms of whether that's sort of jhana light, that's within the jhana camps that have emerged
Absolutely.
more recently.
That's the sort of sub-battle.
Whether how deep
what,
they are.
What is jhana really?
And there's some, I think, kind of critical review of the Suddhimagga around,
Yes.
because a lot of those terms are not found in the sutta descriptions of the jhanas.
Yes.
And so the next question is, well, what's being described in the sutta jhanas? Is it something a little bit more accessible or easier to attain?
Right.
Because the Visuddhimagga is saying these are very rare and hardly attainable.
Right.
So then there's that contest between those two camps.
You know all about the jhana wars.
There is, yeah.
Yeah. But at the very base level, where you get a lot of people who are kind of new to the Dhamma, it seems like almost for many people just kind of a contest over technique, where vipassana is defined as a technique and samadhi is defined as a technique, and which is the right technique. And that's kind of a first stage misconception that they're techniques at all, and that they're separate, that they're separable.
Right.
Yeah, and I think again, not getting hyper-focused allows us to see it in context. Like one teacher says that jhana is this, another teacher says that jhana is this. Well, you can't really measure them against each other. The way that you measure them is, can they accomplish what we chanted tonight? If both of them can accomplish what we chanted tonight, then they're both applicable to the path. If neither, then they're both crap, no matter how much they might seem to mirror what's in the Pali Canon. Again, kind of looking at like what's it for, and then can what you've got do that? And so the people who are saying you only need basic, access concentration to do this work, they're right. You can get this work done. But are they right in every circumstance? Is somebody going to have enough energy to stay with it until they get all of the insight? If they haven't applied themselves to samadhi, that can't be said authoritatively. So it's a value to read the whole scene. It's a value to read this teacher's perspective and that teacher's perspective. Anything that gets you closer to doing what we chanted tonight and what follows the higher knowledges, that's the right way, no matter if it matches what's in the suttas or not.
I like enlightenment is karma.
That's not a question.
Do I have a question there?
You don't need one.
Is that
Don't cave in.
You have an answer. Am I supposed to have a question?
enlightenment is karma? Yeah.
The shift.
Shift. You're not even saying that that different actions follow enlightenment. You're saying it's like it's not one follows the other. It's one and the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And in fact, this was one of the great sort of aha moments is when you have confidence that you've met somebody who actually is enlightened, and you realize they're a normal person. You realize that they didn't add anything. It was purely a matter of subtraction. Like they just subtracted all of the stuff that was delusion, and everything else that was left is not a problem. So an enlightened person is super normal, and that's what's spectacular about them. So they're always normal. When they're hungry, when they're sad, when they're sleepy, when things go well, when things go poorly, they're normal. Because what's missing? The karma of reacting, the karma of craving, the karma of resisting is no longer present.
There's also this idea that these different stages, these different insights, these different knowledges, that they can be experienced like in loops, and then understood at a deeper and deeper level at a different. And I think you might have sort of glanced at that.
Yeah, when I was talking about the so-called jhana summary, actually, to me, it's more of like a first pass through the dynamic of getting ready for jhana in a sense by developing concentration. In a sense, preparation for the higher levels of samadhi is very similar to what you actually do when you get the higher level of samadhi. Ajahn Sucitto's really helped me to turn towards samadhi practice, because I came from this IMS scene where I barely heard of it. I don't think the teachers even mentioned the term. I just was a reader. And certainly at TFM, samadhi is almost a bad word with Ajahn Sumedho. They're kind of patriarchal figure. But Ajahn Sucitto, who is in that tradition, wrote a lovely short book on samadhi where he kind of, I guess can be summarized with the idea that what he is setting forward is a correction to the idea that you have to really work. You have to, we hear the word concentration, and it's about furrowing the brows and rolling up your sleeves and zeroing in. And that if you do that work, if you really focus, you will find this way to happiness. But his point is that no, you have to get really happy in order to develop the samadhi. And he offers the corrective to the notion of happiness, which is simply, it's the one that trips most of us up most of the time. That we're not talking about the happiness of excitement, of agitation, like the happiness of thrills or sensual pleasure. It's the happiness of contentment. And actually, we notice that the penultimate preparatory stage, which comes first, contentment or mindfulness? Before
contentment is the last one.
Yeah. And I remember as an anagarika, I was reflecting on, what is nibbana? Nibbana is the end of suffering. Dukkha. Sometimes that's translated as dissatisfaction. And what's the opposite of that? If I can figure out the opposite of that, maybe I'll have a hint as to what nibbana is. And the opposite of dissatisfaction is satisfaction, contentment. And it makes sense to me that just cultivating simple contentment, it sets the ground. Actually, for Bhante Buddhasa, Ajahn Buddhadasa talked about this idea of momentary nibbana. I think he's the one who put that on the map. That we actually have moments in the course of our ordinary life where we're content. We'll quickly spin off into something else, but we have moments of acceptance, moments of contentment where there is nothing where we're okay with things as they are. It's not stable. But actually, I like to imagine, like, what if those moments didn't end? To me, like a moment of contentment, if that just went on, I mean, it's kind of incomprehensible what that would be. To me, it's as incomprehensible as nibbana. So yeah, I think what Bhante Suchita was pointing to is the contentment specifically in integrity. We cultivate sila so that we can develop a sense of quiet contentment with how we are in the world, regardless of how things go. We know that we're okay. Our sila is strong. We're living with integrity. We can always take contentment in that if we guard our sila. And from that, we get a kind of lightness and ease. And that is a pleasure in the body that can give rise to, when we reflect on it, to piti. And so we're into that cycle that actually is the cycle that finds its culmination in the jhanas. I wanted to add one vocabulary point from last night. Bhante Pramuto pointed out that jayati, the verb that shares the root with jhana, means burning, and it does indeed, and there's a really interesting connection between that sense of jayati and also the sense that it's often used in, which just means meditation, and it's regularly used in a way that means basically what we mean by meditation, although always with a kind of religious significance. But I'd like to point that out because we often construe the jhanas as in this kind of discrete way, that they're these separate stages of attainment. But if you think of jhana if you think of it not as like first jhana, second jhana, third jhana, but as the first meditation, the second meditation, the third meditation, we can see it as more of like a continuum, with less concern for getting from one stage to the other or knowing exactly which stage we're at, which actually helps in developing them.
Yeah, I can think there's to your point that jhanas aren't something that's being done as much as they're describing a state that the mind is in. They're describing us and our level of happiness. There's a Dhammapada verse that says, the sun shines by day, the moon shines by night, a warrior shines in armor, a meditator shines in jhana. So it uses that verb of jayati in the sense of shining. And so seeing the word jhana is just talking about the mind is shining. It's luminous, it's bright, it's joyful, it's composed. And that's what we're doing. We're composing our mind. We're making it bright through removing the impurities of distraction, the impurities of bad sila, the impurities of dissatisfaction. Removing all of those and you get jhana.
Yeah, I mean, the flip side of that is that jhana is simply what happens when meditation deepens beyond a certain point. In a sense, it is meditation. That's when meditation really starts, as opposed to like kind of stumbling towards it with kind of halting, fumbling, pre-meditation, meditation.
thoughts? Right. Sadhu, sadhu.